Running out of time, so I'm going to ask one more question and we'll go to closing statements. What did you think of the response of local law enforcement to the active shooter situations like what happened in Sandy Hook? And what do you propose be the response of the Sheriff's Office to active shooter situations like Sandy Hook? Bill, your question.
Well, that's a very interesting question. It's complex, but could be simple. If I knew more about the actual layout of Sandy Hook, where the school was, where the jurisdictional boundaries were, what the interlocal agreements were locally there, and the response times, any of the pre-planning. I have no knowledge of what their plans were, if they had any. Seems like they had some weaknesses in that area. But trying to answer a question like that is totally speculative. It gets back to the issue on the security stuff. Each environment is different, the situations are different, the demographics are different. The response time, if it's good or bad, of the local law enforcement and first responders. There's so many factors there that we could spend the next several hours in a seminar discussing all those attributes. So I'm not really sure the goal of your question.
I just want to know what is your opinion on, or what the Sheriff's Office should do in the case of an active shooter situation like what happened in Sandy Hook or San Bernardino or any one of a dozen different active shooter situations we've had in the last 6 years.
Well, it depends on the interlocal agreements, the staffing of the police, the staffing of the sheriff. Within certain boundaries, it could be purely a SWAT team from the police department. It could require augmentation from the sheriff. Sandy Hook could have been in the jurisdiction of the county. It would be totally the sheriff's responsibility to react. So the sheriff always has a responsibility because as the chief law enforcement of the county, and how much action is taken by the sheriff department is dependent upon that pre-planning, which gets back to my discussion earlier about mobilizing for Desert Storm. When you do your planning, you look at your county, you look at your cities within the county, you look at all of the scenarios of what you have to deal with, and you put forward planning in process to deal with the requirements necessary for each one of those potential situations. Giving you a specific answer is impossible at the moment. Plus, you also have to comprehend forward-looking things like the growth that was mentioned earlier. How are those demographics going to change, and how are you going to be able to have your training and your resources in place to meet the challenges when those variables actually change? It just happens to be an area where I've had significant expertise in the industry as well as in the military for forward-looking and being able to respond immediately when the occasions occur.
Okay, thank you. Robert?
If I'd have told you 20 years ago that we would have a shooting at a school called Sandy Hook and that many kids were killed, murdered while they were learning, you probably thought I was crazy. Kind of similar to the bank robbery shooting in California years ago when I was at APD, when officers didn't have AR-15s in their car, all they had were shotguns. And law enforcement has a history of kind of reacting to the culture that's developing. And that's just because you can't think of every scenario that's occurring all the time. But we have a duty as a leader of an agency to try to be thinking out the box as much as we can. And that starts, and I think you can have some specific answers to that. That starts in our own local area. Who do we know? What do we have here, resources here to utilize, and try to think of every scenario that you can think of, because in some aspects they may be different, but they're alike in a lot of ways as well too. Something as simple as training with the other agencies. You don't have to have an interlocal agreement to do training with other law enforcement agencies. Going to Austin and Cedar Park and saying, hey, what are your plans if this happens? Because they might have a great idea. They may have a great plan already in process. Hey, how can we get on board? If we were to get a mass shooting at this school, how would you help us respond to this? What channel on the radio station would you go to? How long would it take for SWAT to get here? You can't rely on SWAT. SWAT is a good resource, but patrol are the first ones. That's why we have AR-15s in our cars now, because the old thought that we used to have for mass shootings was, okay, get to the scene. It wasn't until Columbine. You noticed on Columbine, officers were there, but they weren't going in because the protocol then was to, okay, wait for some more officers, let's wait for SWAT or whatever. Well, that's not, after Columbine, law enforcement realized, hey, we have to have an initial team. Those are the first 2 or 3 responding officers. And as soon as they get there, they have to go in, because if they don't, lives will be lost. We realize that as a law enforcement community. So we have to be proactive in that aspect. Another way to be proactive, though, is before a mass shooting at a school or things that you can think of, go to the schools. Say, and do security checks on the school. They have SROs say, hey, where are your vulnerable areas at? What is the main entrance? Understand those areas before you do that. Kind of like in the constables, love to simplify it. We have all the gate codes of all the apartment complexes. Even when they're brand new, we get that information. That way, if we need to get in there for something, we can relay that to our dispatch. But not just for the constables, but for the responding agency. So having those relationships with law enforcement, whether it's the task force